Today, I'm honored to speak with Craig S. Harwood. He is the author of Bridget's Gambit, a saga of family enterprise in Gold Rush, California. It's a really interesting book that's going to be coming out soon. And Craig is going to tell us all about this fascinating story of early California, his connection to it, and what he learned by writing about it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an engineering geologist by profession, and I've been doing geology for about 35 years, centered kind of in central California, the coastal area. And as a hobby, I've always loved history, researching history and writing about history. So it's been something on the side I've always entertained myself with. And I'm also a descendant of the main character of the book, Bridget Evoy. And in my ancestry, there's a couple generations there on one side of the family who really interesting people did some remarkable things. And removed from me about 4 generations back, they came to California 1849, as you'll learn reading the book. And so my family have been here ever since then, which is kind of cool. And my interest in this particular in writing this book was more not so much about the fact that they're my ancestors, that's probably hard to believe, but I'm just so fascinated by history and California history, and these people did some pretty remarkable things. They got caught up in important events in California history. They mixed with a lot of the movers and shakers in the mid-19th century in California. So it was just a natural thing for me to want to do, given my interests.
So, can we back up just a little bit? What does the research geologist do?
Well, I'm an engineering geologist.
I'm engineering geologist. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the consulting profession. So when people want to develop properties and they have geologic hazards that they have to deal with, then I go out and study the property and give them some guidance on how to deal with landsliding issues, faulting issues. We do work on everything from residential sites to university campuses. I've done a lot of work at Stanford University, for example. And so, but it's essentially consulting geology.
So you get out and about a lot.
A lot. Yeah, I do.
You kind of get to experience California geography and geology firsthand, which is nice.
Yeah, I do. What's ironic and kind of funny is that a lot of some of the places that are important in this story are in the Bay Area region and other parts of Central California, and I often do work around these areas, so I can visit some of these locations, former ranch sites, former property sites, and which was very helpful in my research to sort of get the setting, and I'm familiar with the geography, which was very helpful.
Yeah, I think that comes across in the book, which I think is great. And I think that's one of the things that with California history, at least those of us who live here, we feel tied, and probably people who left here as well, they feel tied to that geography and that landscape. And so what occurs in the historical scenes is sort of tied to the geography of California, and which gives it its character. But I didn't know that I don't think I had caught that you were a descendant of the main characters. So could you talk a little bit about Bridget Evoy, and am I pronouncing that correctly?
Evoy, yeah, close
Evoy.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about her family trajectory? I know she starts out in Ireland, right? And
That's right.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? What sort of made her come from the old sod to California?
Well, yeah, she was born in Ireland in 1791 to a working class rural Irish family. They lived on an estate. They were sharecroppers, basically, and lived in a primitive one-room stone cabin type structure. And at that time, the women in the family, as girls, they were uh, raised to just participate in the family economy. They learned animal husbandry, and they learned how to do things like weaving and practical skills. But they really didn't have much of a future to look forward to, because as the family owned some, they were able to cultivate some land on this larger manor, and then as the generations went down, they would give parcels to various family members. So as you went down in generations, you had less and less opportunities to do farming. And so I think it was about 1820, Bridget married a man named James Evoy, and they began to have a family. So by 1828, they now had 5 children. And they decided that there was just no future in rural Ireland for them. So they decided to come to America. The husband went first. Often what happens is a family member, usually at that time it was the husband, would go to the new country and try to find some opportunity, a place to live, land, a job. And so that's what James Evoy did in 1828. And then once he established himself in Missouri, which was frontier at that point, he sent for his wife, Bridget, and she took a schooner, the transatlantic passage with her children and traveled across, and they settled in Missouri in early 1829. And just to kind of skip forward a little bit, her husband died of pneumonia in 1830. She was in St. Louis, and she was now a widow trying to raise 5 children. She didn't have a lot of opportunities to do for making a living. At that time, most women would have remarried, to try to secure some financial future, especially when they have the pressure of caring for 5 children. She seems to have dug in her heels and decided not to do that, and was determined to survive on her own. So she was running a ranch, while at the same time, she started to cultivate business relationships in St. Louis, started doing land deals, buying and selling land. And it was a pretty modest market in St. Louis at the time. This would have been the 1830s, going into the 1840s. So she was able to survive, but really not prosper very much. Damien, I can't hear you right now.
Oh yeah, I
Sorry.
need to unmute myself.
Sorry.
That helps. Yeah. So you talked about the fact that she didn't take the normal route, which might have been, as a fairly young widow, might have been to remarry, but instead began to enter into business, right, and do land deals. Is that one of the things that sort of made you curious about her story and delving into it more? Because that was a fairly unusual thing, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that independent streak and stubbornness, instead of caving to what society pressured women in that situation to do certain things, she seems to have dug in their heels and just was determined not to do that. And for the rest of her adult life, that was kind of the theme. The undercurrent in her life story was just refusing to bend to social customs in the Victorian era. There's a lot of pressure on women socially to conform, because women, if you follow the literature and just society's attitudes, it was all about women as passive players in society. And they were, the idea was that women were frail, and they needed to be taken care of, is kind of the idea, which is really the whole notion of patriarchy, is that women are not able to act on their own as their own power players in society. And so it seemed to me that she decided early on that she wasn't going to kowtow to that, and she was going to make her own decisions and do what she thought was right for her and her family, for her survival.
And she was Irish, so there was that also there was also that experience of the anti-Irish sentiment in the U.S. at the time, which you mentioned. Can you paint us a little bit of a picture of what it would have been like for an Irish immigrant at that time and a woman settling in the U.S.?
Yeah, Irish Catholic, where so she had two strikes against her. There was a lot of anti-Catholicism in that period of time, as well as anti-Irish sentiment. St. Louis kind of had a little bit of support system, and there were a lot of people who came from Ireland who settled there, and they sort of tried to help each other out as much as they could. But yeah, just yeah, there was a bias against Irish Catholics in particular. And you see that a lot in the literature. And I don't know a lot about her personal experiences other than in general, she would have found it a little more difficult to do things the way she wanted. But it didn't seem, as her life story played out, it didn't seem to be too much of a problem. She seemed to be able to do what she wanted to do once she set her mind on a certain goal.
Well, she winds up in the gold country. She winds up in Northern California, which is really where most of this story takes place. Could you give us an idea of what was the catalyst and the process that brought her west from where it seems in St. Louis she was starting to establish herself?
Yeah, when the news of the gold rush hit, this would have been late 1848. A lot of people, of course, uprooted their lives and came west. I think the family resisted for a little while, but eventually Bridget sat down with everybody. By now, her daughters and sons were adults, and one of her daughters, Margaret, had married a man named John McCourtney, who becomes important in the story. But they sat down in St. Louis and decided that they wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to come out and just improve their situation in life. I don't think that the real estate market in St. Louis was all that good at the time. It was pretty modest. So the idea of this easy wealth in California just sounded really appealing to them. And given her background, how she grew up in a working class environment in Ireland, I think that probably influenced her just to try to pursue the opportunity that was available. So the family packed it up and made this epic journey across the United States. I was able to find certain gold rush travelers kept journals, and I was able to find the occasional mention of this family group as they traveled across. So I was able to kind of piece together their path, not only how they got here, but how long it took. And also because I was able to read, I was able to find out there are certain people who kept journals who traveled within a day or two of her group, camped with them sometimes. And so I was able to figure out kind of the situations they dealt with as they made this overland journey, which is really fascinating, especially when they tried to cross the Sierras. They were really late in the season. This was November, and everybody was desperate to get over the Sierras before the winter set in. And this was only 2 years after the Donner Party tragedy. So everybody who was stuck in the Basin and Range, say in September of 1849, were starting to think about, are we going to be able to cross the Sierras before the winter sets in? Because we sure don't want to suffer that fate. So they ended up getting in there really late, and they had to work their way through snowstorm after snowstorm in that last 2 weeks of the Sierra crossing, and nearly got in deep trouble. But they and a lot of the other people who were at the very end of the immigration were rescued by some Teamsters who were set up to help rescue all these people. So they arrived in the Sacramento Valley just after Thanksgiving, having barely survived the Sierra crossings. Very dramatic part of the story, which I expanded quite a bit. I think the Overland Trail part of their story takes up about 2.5 chapters. I thought it was very dramatic, and it said a lot about their mettle and about how tenacious she was, because she actually led the wagon train at different periods of time when certain crises came up. She stepped in, and you could see this is somebody who had a lot of determination, and it was quite bold. And so I thought that part of their story deserved quite a bit of coverage. And I really enjoyed that. I really did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Especially, I seem to recall that there were some moments where Bridget really said, "I'm going to take the lead in this situation," and it could have turned out differently.
Yeah, one example was when they decided to go to Salt Lake City, which was a major diversion from the main California trail. They needed to their oxen were getting weak. They were running low on supplies. So they decided to take this side route to Salt Lake City, and they encamped there for about a week. And the group decided to split up. Some people wanted to take the southern route, which sort of headed toward Death Valley. And Bridget had heard through rumor that there were some folks in the southern area just south of Salt Lake City who were hostile, and there was a possibility it could be dangerous if they went that direction. So Bridget decided, she announced to the group that she was going to take the northern route, and anybody who wanted could follow her. And so there was a difference of opinion. Half the group went south and half the group went north with Bridget. And she literally led the group to the north along the Salt Lake cutoff. Well, it turns out years later, she met a man who was part of that southern group who headed to the south. And I guess the group were massacred by men who were, from what I understand, dressed as Indians. And this one man was the only one who survived. So later he told her this harrowing story. So they narrowly escaped that whole situation. And then as they traveled across further heading to the Sierras, they took the Lassen Trail route, which went to the north. It wasn't the traditional trail like the Truckee and the Carson Pass trails. So on the Lassen Trail, they got up into a really rugged area. They took a fork in the trail and weren't sure which way to go. And so it led to they spent all day long going in this direction, and it ended up into a box canyon, and they couldn't go any further. So Bridget stepped forward and just gave everybody kind of a talk and said, look, let's just turn around, go back to the main trail where we started at that same fork, and then take the other direction. And by the time they got back there, they ran into a military group had been sent because they'd heard they were late in arriving at Lassen's Pass. So those are two examples of her taking some leadership when things got really difficult.
That episode kind of shows not only was she forceful in taking the lead when she needed to, but I think another characteristic that was very important is the idea of, well, you know what? We made a wrong turn. Let's change our plan and go back and start again, which I think in some cases people get in trouble in situations like that because they don't want to face the fact that, hey, maybe we made a wrong move and we need to backtrack.
Right. That's right. Exactly.
So
yeah, I think, yeah, for sure. Sorry.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. So they come to California, and that's really where the family sort of makes their fortune, especially with the gold rush. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What really is it that allows Bridget and her family to become successful or to survive, first of all?
Well, in a sentence, instead of chasing after gold, they exploited the gold miners. So initially they bought land. They found out, I think, through talking to some people who'd been to California before the gold rush, that there was you could navigate the Sacramento River up to Sacramento City and then continue up the Feather River up further into the northern Sacramento Valley. And that led to the confluence of the Feather River and Yuba River at modern day Marysville. At the time, it was just a ranch. Mm-hmm. But they'd heard that this was an ideal location because that would be a stepping off point for boats coming up to try and deliver people to the gold country. So if you could take a boat up the Feather River, get off at what was eventually Marysville, you could go right up into the foothills. So people would go up there and bring supplies. So the family found out about this settlement. They settled there right away, started buying parcels. They set up a trading post. They started doing land deals almost immediately. Bridget's 21-year-old daughter walked into the local land office and bought a parcel under her own name. It was very unusual. And this is the first year of the gold rush when there weren't a lot of women in California, much less a single woman who was willing to buy land in her own name. Bridget turned around and started buying all kinds of parcels. So they were doing land deals. They were selling merchandise. They started branching out. One of her other daughters, Margaret, who emerged as a very prolific businesswoman, also started buying land. They bought land at the Bear River, which leads up into the Nevada City, Grass Valley area, very important mining region. They set up a toll bridge there. They set up a farm. They built a boarding house. They had a general merchandise store there. They had a lumber mill, a blacksmith shop. And so this family were just spreading out very quickly and just tapping every possible avenue of business that served the miners and people heading up into the mining districts. So they put themselves at key locations. Bridget and her daughter, Ellen, settled in Marysville, which was key for all those people stepping off the boats and stocking up to head for the mining fields. Margaret, the other daughter, was positioned. There was a major trail that crossed the Bear River, and with that toll bridge, they were able to take advantage of all that traffic going up into the mining district. So they're very shrewd and very smart about how they exploited the opportunities right away. The miners were chasing after the gold, and they were there to provide them all the services they needed. Very smart.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, how in the story, we're in 1849 or 1848 or 1849?
1849, 1850, yeah.
1849, 1850. How many family members are there, and who are they?
Well, they came to California so there's Bridget, her daughter, Margaret, who's married to John McCourtney, so it was Margaret McCourtney, her daughter Ellen, who was my great-great-grandmother, and then her youngest son, James, who was about 20 years old when they arrived here. Then there was a son, John, who came out separately. He was somewhere, I don't really know. I wasn't able to figure out exactly where he was initially. Then another daughter stayed back in St. Louis. They all eventually settled in California once the main family or the family got established.
So what would you say was the key? You mentioned the fact that, she decided right away, let's sell to the miners rather than trying to get in there and mine gold ourselves. But they could have gone bust. What do you think that the key to their continuing and lasting success was, even after sort of the gold rush had played itself out?
Bridget, all three of the daughters, Bridget, Ellen, and Margaret, were very keen on keeping their ear to the ground on changing situations. They were buying and selling land in different areas as these boom towns showed up and started flourishing. They would buy land, and then after a short while, they'd sell it because the value would go up pretty quickly. That's the whole nature of the boom and bust economy. So they were very prescient about how they would look a couple of steps ahead, kind of anticipate where the next opportunity was, and then they would start moving in that direction. But they had their hands in a lot of pies, it seemed, all three of the daughters. They didn't seem to be in any way intimidated by their status being women, acting as independent business people in a distinctly masculine setting in a Victorian era. They just did whatever they thought was going to give them the best opportunities, and they were not in any way thwarted from doing land deals, dealing with these powerful movers and shakers who were invariably men in the northern Sacramento Valley. Some of them quite famous. They just did their business deals with them. And yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I was really struck by just this attitude of not even thinking about societal attitudes toward women. They just did whatever they felt was necessary, and they didn't seem to be thwarted by it at all. Kind of inspiring.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things that's inspiring about it, which you depict pretty well, is we're not only dealing with a society where they're women and surrounded by men, but it's a dangerous place, right? And can you tell us a little bit about some of the inherent dangers of setting up shop in, the northern Sacramento Valley in 1850?
Yeah, there was a lot of violence. You had vigilante committees running around and executing, exacting punishment just on a whim. You had a lot of questionable characters. The mining region would attract a lot of questionable characters, just the nature of it. So they would run boarding houses, for example, and they'd have these people sleeping in the same place they're living in. So they had to trust the people. They also had to be tough. They had to have a tough exterior, because I think that the men would probably react to that differently than if they were timid. And I think that Bridget, I can imagine her as a very no-nonsense person who would put somebody in their place pretty quick. And I don't think a lot of people tried things with her. There is a side story a little bit later on. It happened in about 1853, where a man tried to rob her of her. She was traveling with some gold dust, and he tried to rob her of that, took advantage of her. And he paid the price for that. He was caught, and the local sheriff believed her story, and he was put in prison. She retrieved all her gold. But yeah, I think you have to be, as a woman in that period of time, you had to walk into these situations with an attitude, and people would, the men would react to you a little bit differently if you did. And the best way I could describe it.
They eventually, and maybe I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but they eventually wind up in the Bay Area in, what is today Oakland. How did that come about, and what was it that led them to move up there?
I'm not sure exactly what the background was on the decision, but Bridget did own property both in San Francisco and at Santa Clara. And she may have come to the Bay Area on business, and the East Bay Area at the time, this is about 1853, was starting to grow a little bit. People were starting to see the East Bay Area as this land of promise where you could get land, you could range cattle, you could grow grain crops. And so some people were turning away from the gold region and starting to focus their attention on that potential in the East Bay Area. So Bridget heard about this and decided to go, and she bought 100 acres in what is now North Oakland from the Peraltas, who owned the land at the time. She bought it with a satchel full of gold dust, $1,000 worth of gold dust, which is very atmospheric. And at the time, Oakland had about 120 citizens, if you can imagine that. And North Oakland was just a very rural area. It was about almost a day's horseback ride down to what is now the waterfront at Lake Merced, downtown Oakland. So it was a long trip just to get to what is now downtown Oakland. And she established a farm there, started growing grain, and she was good friends with Jose Vicente Peralta. And she was an early pioneer of that area. And so the family, one by one, escaped from the gold region and settled around her property. So they ended up owning a lot of property in what is now the Temescal district of northern Oakland. They were influential pioneering citizens in that area.
Yeah, you tell a story there about how the town of Oakland, the city of Oakland, got its name as Oakland. Do you recall that? Would you mind telling us that story?
Yeah, just it was known for these magnificent trees. There was a Spanish word, encinal, and the first mayor of Oakland named it after that idea. It was just these beautiful, it was a forest of beautiful ancient oak trees everywhere. Uh, it's really interesting to think about Oakland now. That area where her ranch was at is a metropolis now. And at the time, it was just this pastoral setting with beautiful oak trees everywhere and farms and really huge, very large tracts of land. All farms were, and just the occasional homestead spread out by probably half a mile apart, something like that. And the roads were, Telegraph Avenue was just a dirt road, and so was San Pablo Avenue, a rutted dirt road that you took your spring wagon down if you wanted to go into the village of Oakland. It was going to be a long, long trip down there to get supplies and whatever.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that though. Yeah, like as you mentioned, if you start digging into the names of these places and you begin to realize that what not so long ago, really, a lot of cities like Oakland, San Francisco, Walnut Creek, were completely different than we may picture them now.
Yeah, in fact, the it was called Oakland was called Contra Costa initially by the California families, and that stands for other coast. What that meant was Yerba Buena, San Francisco's on the other side of the bay, so the Contra Costa was the other coast, and the ships would come in and trade in hides and tallow from the Peraltas, and so they had a little wooden wharf right there, roughly where Emeryville is. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things like that. These names are great, of course.
So she had some tragedy in her family. Um, she lost one of her sons, correct? Can you talk
That's
a little
right.
bit about that and how she dealt with that tragedy in particular, but with others also?
Yeah, well, she lost her husband, shortly after
Right.
arriving in America, and so her reaction to that was she decided that she was determined to survive on her own. When she got to California, somewhere around 1850, her youngest son James, who was about 20, got involved in a quartz mining operation up in the foothills, not far from Marysville. The women stayed in Marysville running their trading post and doing land deals. And James got involved in the mining operation. He was riding down into the settlements to get some blasting powder and was ambushed by a few Native Americans, it's believed, and was killed. And so the local citizens got together and formed a vigilante committee, and they were swearing to take revenge on the local tribe. They went to Bridget to get her blessing, to get her support, and she said, "No, there's no point in doing that. That's not going to bring my boy back." Was the quote. So she was very, very pragmatic and mature enough. She was 61 years old by this point in time. And so she was mature enough to understand that the cycle of retribution was pointless. It just ended a lot of lives. It served no purpose. And so the local tribe heard about this, and the elders came to her and thanked her for it. And she kind of got a reputation for being this matriarch who, one of the leaders in the community there in Marysville. I should add, just as a tangent, she rode 1,800 miles on the Overland Trail on horseback at 59 years old. Now,
Wow.
as a geologist, I spent a lot of time out in the Basin and Range in northern Nevada, Black Rock Desert, and a lot of these places that they traveled through. I had the luxury of a large pickup truck, air conditioned, but I've gone out and tromped around in that kind of a setting, and it's absolutely brutal. Even with all the comforts of home with you, it's a brutal environment. I'm 65. I couldn't imagine doing something like that, riding horseback through a setting like that week after week after week, and just dealing with being exposed like that. So she was very tenacious, even despite her age.
I think that we sometimes don't give people credit for the amount of strength and courage that they had just to carry out what seemed like very basic things, traveling from one place to another. But it really was uh, heroic, what
Yeah.
she did and how she managed to live her life. Would you say in studying Bridget's life, um, would you say there was any sort of major change that took place in her over the years, or is by the time by the way, when does she pass away? What year does she die?
In 1867, she passed away.
So in 1867, is she still the same Bridget, or has her experience in California, coming across the country, coming from Ireland, has it transformed her in some way, or is there an in between?
With her, the only real transformation was when her husband died and she was on her own all of a sudden. It was scary. She seems to have made a decision that she wasn't going to she wasn't going to play the victim, and she wasn't going to be a passive player in her own life and rely on a husband to provide her with financial support. She decided she was going to do it on her own. That seems to be the major change. Everything from that point onward, she was extremely tenacious and just was always forging ahead, very prescient in her business movements, undaunted in just about everything she did. That was the original title of my book, by the way. I had to change it eventually because there's several undaunteds out there, but I can't think of any word other than tenacious. Undaunted would be another really good word to describe her. But her personality and the things she did didn't really seem to change after that. That was the major changing point in her life. Was now she was on her own, and she decided she's going to provide for her family, and she's not going to rely on anybody else. Society be damned, you know.
How did the family fare? The children, after she dies, they're quite a well-to-do family at that point. How did their future, at least for that first generation, unfold?
Yeah, they were very fortunate. Bridget's property was divided up, and all of the family took parts of it. Margaret McCourtney had her own land. She was actually the most prolific of all the three women in the family as far as a business person. She was very successful and extremely ambitious. She had so many different investment avenues that she pursued. But to answer your question, all the family members benefited by the fact that Bridget saw that opportunity in rural or northern Oakland at the time, bought that land. And because she saw the location as being very important, and she tried to promote the idea of getting a transportation system running through that part of Oakland. The family, as they bought land and settled down, they pursued that idea of trying to get a transportation network. The key route system was eventually put in there. There were horse-drawn carriages. The whole system was brought up, Telegraph Avenue. And so the family's properties were bordering all of that. And so they promoted the idea of establishing that, and they all benefited from a lot. They all were also being, devout Catholics. They were involved in local Catholic missions, and they tried to help the underprivileged. Margaret was particularly active in that. So they tried to use their position of wealth to help people who were struggling in society. And I think that goes back to Bridget's upbringing in Ireland, really, being brought up as essentially a peasant, and that hard life that they had, and the hard life that her whole family knew for generations.
Now you mentioned their Catholic faith, and it's sort of a thread that goes through the whole book, even though it's not a dominant theme. What would you say was the effect of that faith on Bridget, on the family? And you mentioned in the book that she has connections to the sort of the nascent Catholic hierarchy in the West Coast in the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah, I think that it did play an important role in their ability to push through adversity. They are, I'm not a person of faith myself, but they were extremely religious. And I think that they prayed a lot and they turned to their faith to help them through tough times. Even though there was obviously this tenacious streak that ran down that line of women. There's no question about that. There's a lot of evidence for that throughout the whole story. But I think if you were to go step in a time machine and go back and talk to these women, they probably would take less credit for themselves and would credit their ability to survive through their faith. I'm certain of that.
What about your own family? Was there lore or family recollections of this story that you received, or was it mostly from original research you did?
Good question. Yeah, as I was growing up, these family stories were passed on to myself, my brother, and my sister through oral family tradition. So I'd heard anecdotes about Bridget, about her daughters, her grandson, and other family members, and I was fascinated by this. And there have been authors who have said in various journal articles and newspaper articles, "Gosh, this is a great this 2 or 3 generations of this family are just really fascinating, and it's worthy of a great book." And you'd see that comment made over and over again. And I would see that as I was growing up, got my college education, and eventually in geology, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of writing. And so I was in the right position to finally, that I figured that story wasn't going to write itself. Somebody's going to have to get in there, research, and do it. But the fact that I had the family oral tradition myself, I had access to that. I could kind of fill in, and I knew sort of where the story leads. And I just used research to fill in where it needed to be done and piece the whole story together. So it was very much a detective story, but it was really great to have the family oral tradition as some kind of a starting point.
Where did you start when you wanted to write this story? How did you begin?
I started doing some research, just to, boring public records to kind of fill in the framework. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, we go visit the Sierras a couple times a year, spend a lot of time up there. And I loved when I was up there, that atmosphere lent itself to thinking about the 1800s and what it would be like to be, pioneering citizen and be involved in the gold rush and all of that. And I was just fascinated by it. So I just started writing it. And it caught on, it just started rolling like a snowball, especially when I discovered these primary sources coming out of, or sort of detailing their trip on the Overland Trail and how they crossed the Sierras. Once I discovered that, I started putting that whole part of the story together, and the snowball just got rolling and rolling and rolling, and I couldn't stop. So I reached out to the publisher and said, "I want to do this story. Here's, in 3 sentences, here's what it is." And they said, sounds great. And I'd already done a book with them before. It was pretty successful. So they gave me the green light, and I finished it. I guess it was about almost 2 years it took me from the time I approached them and got tacit approval to the time it was finally accepted by them for publication. That whole time I was moving it along and writing it more and more, and just trying to work on drawing the reader in and keeping them wanting to turn those pages. That's probably the most difficult thing for a writer, the most challenging thing. Anybody can sit down and write something, but to write something that makes somebody want to read it, to pick it up and they read the introduction or whatever, the first page or the first chapter, you have to set a hook and just pull them in. And I really enjoyed that. There are some really skilled writers out there who can do that just effortlessly. For me, it was a real workout. I had to run through many, many drafts of it before I was happy that I felt like I'd kind of done that.
Do you have writers that you imitate in that, or how did you hone that skill of the hook in the historical narrative?
Probably James Michener. when I was younger, I used to read his books, except that's historical fiction. But he kind of uses, he sets a setting, he makes it vivid, he gets you involved in these characters. He has a way of bringing out what's compelling about their story. So I just try to use my own judgment. I figured if something was fascinating to me, it must be fascinating to other people. I just have to communicate it in a way that they can access that.
So you mentioned you wrote another book. Tell us a little bit about that book. And having written a previous book, did it make writing this one easier?
Yeah, it did make it easier. The first book was Quest for Flight. It's a biography about John J. Montgomery, who was Bridget's grandson, by the way.
I see a
And
theme.
he was an aviation pioneer back in the 1880s, extending up to about 1910. And he predated the Wright brothers. And he originated a lot of the most basic principles of flight, doing it on his own, working in isolation in rural areas. And I thought it was a great story. And so I had a co-author, he and I, Gary Fogel, and I got together and we wrote that book. I felt kind of constrained because it was a book about really on an aviation history theme. I love the Western history part of that. And so I decided later that I really wanted to write a book that was just purely, Western history, really interesting biography. I didn't really want to be hemmed down to a technical subject like aviation history. So I did learn some lessons on how to write a general trade book in that first effort, and it was well received. So in this case, I just tried to push it a little further. I wanted to get a little bit further away from the academic style of writing and make it more lively, bring out the compelling nature of the story. So I was always struggling to try and hone the storytelling in that way.
But you're doing it through a university press, right? University of Oklahoma. So,
Right.
so how do you straddle that line?
It's not easy. It's not easy because the people who peer review a manuscript, they're scholars, PhD historians, and they want to see it done one way. And they're a little resistant to this idea of a general trade book where you're trying to make the narrative lively and you're trying to bring out the color in the story. They're less interested in that. But there was some appreciation of that from some of the peer reviewers. So yeah, it is a kind of an awkward mix of approaches. The scholarly approach. This book is heavily researched versus the trade. If you're trying to produce a trade book which is going to be accessible to the general public, you have to write it in a different way than you would a scholarly book. So I just went with my own instinct, and I'd hoped that I did a good enough job where you pick it up and you want to learn more about the story. You want to just follow it and see where the story goes.
Well, I certainly did. Um, when you think about this book, is there a misconception about the gold rush or about California history that you think it dispels or you would like this book to correct for readers?
I guess the role of women in the gold rush. There are a lot of books that mention women in the gold rush. More often than not, they're mentioning almost the same women each book. Sometimes there's a little variation. And so it gives the impression that women were just crawling all over the Sierras, even though it was kind of this masculine phenomenon. In reality, the first year or two, there was very, very few women. I think the highest estimates are around 15% of the population in the first, maybe the second year of the gold rush was 15% were women. That's on the high end. And if you're talking about the mother lode region, it would be much less than that. And even within the mother lode, an even smaller percentage were single women, or in the case of Bridget, a widow. Most of the women up there were married. And the idea that women who are not attached to a man could go out and be successful business people in this environment is surprising and inspiring. And I think that it's not really discussed very much. And I think it's something, it's very, it's timely. This idea that society identifies who you, they give you a definition, they define you, and then they give you, once you've been defined, there are certain things you're going to be credited with or what's expected of you. And these women seem to just blow off the idea of being defined, and they did whatever they thought was appropriate and just defied the social norms. And I'm particularly amused by the idea that women were seen as weak and frail. These women were as tenacious as any man, more so than most, I would say. Even in the rough and tumble world of the gold rush, these women were forces to contend with. And I love that idea of the story. To me, that's both inspiring. I'm kind of amused by it too. When you think about how society was telling women, here's who you are, here's what you can't do. You're going to have to rely on the men in your life to do these things, to engage in business, to engage in your legal, the legal aspect of your business and all that. I just love the fact they defied all that, and it seemed to be with ease.
Well, you mentioned, I'm just going to go down a little side road here. In 1852, I believe it was, in California, they passed a law that fundamentally changes the way women can transact business, which actually aligns it more with the earlier Spanish-Mexican laws in the territory. And can you describe that a little bit and tell us about how the Evoy family women took advantage of that change in the laws?
Yes, primarily Margaret, who was married, began to do, she entered into contracts on her own. That was one of the things that came out of that law, is it allowed women to act as their own, act in their own self-interest in business transactions, entering into contracts, in legal, like lawsuits and things like that. So even though Margaret was married, she was an independent businesswoman, and she had all kinds of land deals going on, all kinds of entrepreneurial efforts going on, but she did it all in her name. And usually you see these landowner maps of the period, it would mention her, not her and her husband, just her. The property would be in her name, or a business would be in her name, or she'd bring suit against somebody in her name. So she took full advantage of it, which I thought was really interesting. Very prolific and very successful businesswoman.
Did this inspire you for any further projects? Are you working on something else right now, or are you taking a break?
I'm taking a break. The book has just been put up for pre-order, and so I have some work ahead of me to promote it and give talks and do interviews and things. So I think that's where my energy is focused. I also have a full-time job, which is as a geologist. So, I'm not selling books for a living. I'm doing geology. So this is, for me, it's fun, it's a hobby, and I love it. So I don't have any particular plans. Doing a book like this that's well researched, it's exhausting. It takes a lot, especially if you go through university press. They expect a lot of you. And so I found just the process of getting the manuscript accepted for publication was a real workout. It took over a year and a half. So I don't know if I'm up for it anytime soon. I think I'm just going to enjoy sharing this book with the public and do talks like I've done before and do interviews and things. And I really enjoy that.
All right. So Bridget's Gambit, a saga of family enterprise in Gold Rush, California, by Craig S. Harwood, University of Oklahoma Press. And you said it's available for pre-order now?
Yeah. Yeah, available for pre-order, and then it's actually released February 10th.
Oh, okay.
Done pretty well so far. A lot of people have been ordering it, which is nice because it enables Amazon then to start cross-promoting, and it kind of builds up just the promotional campaign before the book is released. Then once it's released, the sales step up really quickly, and then it kind of helps you to promote the thing and get it out there. So, the pre-order phase is probably more important than when the book actually comes out.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Okay. Well, I hope and I think a lot of our listeners are going to be really interested and go out there and pre-order it, especially because it really does shed an important light on a key area, a key time period in California. And, you know, I think about, I know a number of these places. I grew up in the Bay Area. I live up in the Sacramento area now, and all these names of places that you mentioned that I've been to, and imagining what they were like is really fascinating. Especially when you think about a place like Marysville that is completely landlocked now, but was this important center for river traffic and commerce at one point. It's fascinating to see how the fate of that area changed when that ended.
Yeah, it was one of the most, for the first few years of the Gold Rush, Marysville was one of the most important cities in California. I think it was the third largest for a while. And it was strategically located at that confluence of the two rivers adjacent to the Mother Lode region up there, Grass Valley, Nevada City. That was a really important mining region. So Marysville was the gateway to that whole part of the Mother Lode. It was a crucial location. And I think the family, having had experience at St. Louis, which is a gateway to the west, saw it was very similar. So they saw that potential. That's why they settled there and put themselves in situations where they could really capitalize on the miners coming in. So extremely important location.
Well, I thank you for bringing it to life for us, and I appreciate your time. And I really do hope that once you've rested up and got the book out, that you'll work on another one, because I think you do a great job of portraying, depicting California history through real people and through your understanding as a geologist and someone who's traveled all over the place. I think it's excellent, and it is a page turner, just like you were hoping. So thank you again, Craig.
Thank you, Damon. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.